So there is something about this grip
Yes.
that of kind of end of history ideology on foreign policy, which has got a hold on people who have still got quite a clinging grip on power. It seems to me.
I think that's absolutely correct, particularly with the people who are actually wield power. But I think if you look at the coming generations of people who will staff the foreign policy blob, it's very difficult to be a neocon or a hawk.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Lima ou...
Welcome everyone. Welcome back to Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast. At the end of history, the inauguration of the new U.S. president, you may have heard of him, happened yesterday, I believe. We're recording this though on the 4th of January, and we are going to be looking forward to what Trump's foreign policy will be. My name, if you don't know, is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. I'm also joined by, in his first appearance in his guise as a Bunga Cast contributing editor, Lee Jones, calling in from London. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
And very delighted to have back on Daniel Bessner. It's been a while. If you don't know Danny, he does the American Prestige podcast. He also has some other academic titles, which I'm going to completely disregard on his
Who cares?
on his suggestion. Exactly.
Yeah, who
Whatever.
cares? No one
Yeah.
cares. The academy is over, dog. This is 2025. I forgot what year it was for a second. This is 2025. The academy is the thing of the past. All praise Obergruppenführer Trump.
Exactly. This is. We're waiting for a podcaster president to emerge. Trump is definitely a poster president. We're obviously ahead of the times, I guess, technologically and mediatically. But anyway, but to look forward to Trump's second term in office, we should also look back. We'll be asking how much Trump 2 will recapitulate Trump 1, and how much of a break he'll be from Biden's term. I just want to make reference to an interview given by Anthony Blinken, former Secretary of State, in the Financial Times recently, in which he said that the Biden administration had reversed what seemed like inexorable decline through Bidenomics, through big investments at home and so on, such that, and I'm quoting again, we're now operating from a position of strength. Moreover, he felt that his greatest satisfaction as Secretary of State was rebuilding alliances, specifically the efforts to, quote, connect the Atlantic and the Pacific. I thought the Panama Canal already did that, but good on Anthony Blinken, and also show that what happens in one theater has profound consequences in the other. And he cites, for example, inviting Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea to NATO summits, signing up to China, and so on. Anyway, just a bit of scene setting there, and an opportunity to give a man, Anthony Blinken, his say, an ability to reflect back on his term in office. I'm sure he'll thank BungaCast for allowing him to do so, at least as conveyed by me. Anyway, right, Danny, let's go back actually to Trump's first term. What were the key aspects of his foreign policy, and is the right term America First transactionalism? And what would that
So
be?
the key aspect of his foreign policy was basically like every foreign policy since 1945. This is the key thing that it's important not to lose sight of, that it still embraced the American grand strategy of economic and military primacy. The United States maintained its basing structure. The United States maintained its enormously high military budget. The United States put a lot of effort into ensuring that the dollar was and remains the reserve currency. On its fundamentals, on its fundamental structure, it was basically like everything else. The question is, where did it differ? And I think it differed in two not so key aspects, because I don't think they really matter that much, which is this is the trade war with China that everyone likes talking about, and which Biden continued, and which I think was inevitable. I think that the United States was never going to actually accept a China that was able to challenge its regional hegemony in East Asia. Personally, I think that was and is inevitable, and that in 20 years, the United States will not be hegemonic in East Asia, but no one in the blob or no one who would staff a presidential administration is able to admit that to themselves. Basically, Biden just continued that. And then you have Trump's genuine erraticism, like particularly the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the important, well-known Iranian general in Iraq, was something that other presidents probably wouldn't have done. It was done on a whim, but then Trump didn't really do anything besides that except remove the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, which Biden also didn't re-enter. So I think like a lot surrounding Trump, it's a lot of fire and fury, to take a name of a very boring book. I don't know if you guys suffered through that stupid book that came out early on, and Trump is so fucking stupid. But there was a lot of, a lot of fire and fury, but not actual change. And this is why people talking about Trump for so long is so goddamn annoying, because he's in a lot of respects just a typical Republican president who is funnier and who breaks discursive norms. That's the big difference of Trump, and every liberal in the world can't handle that. So they have to write 8 years of boring op-eds, and I'm sure we're going to have more boring op-eds, but basically there's not that much of super interest there when you're looking at it macro historically. The thing that's important is the elections, is the coalitions that he's able to put together, which is really, from my mind, more about the failure of the Democratic Party, and from a broader perspective, the failure of liberalism, than it is per se about Trump himself, even though he is a genuinely charismatic, genuinely entertaining, and genuinely funny candidate. So that's my take on Trump. And I'm sure we'll see more of the same in the second administration, except probably like even less stuff done because he's older and more tired. And there's actual Trumpists who are going to fight with one another. And you saw this H-1B thing over that at this point was a few weeks ago. But obviously, this is not a lasting coalition, and it's going to fight and have a lot of internal contradictions. I was just talking about this.
I should say to listeners that we will have another hour at least of boring talk about Trump here. So just stick around. It's not actually going to be boring.
I was talking about this. Do you know Varn, the podcaster Varn?
Yes.
I was on his podcast the other day. I'm like, yeah, man, it's just like, this is just boring at this point. We're very much in like a stasis period, and it's really not especially interesting to write about or even to really think about. But that's my take. Prove me wrong.
There's your trailer, Alex.
Lee, why don't you try to make this interesting?
Well, let me pick up on what you were saying there about the unstable coalition. So some people who study the radical right have been trying to convince me for some time that Trump too would be different, because he kind of didn't really expect to win. He wasn't prepared last time. He was forced to rely on not very loyal appointees, a kind of ragbag of former generals and neocons like John Bolton and so on. But he's been secretly plotting his return, and people have been building up this cadre of people that can staff the state apparatus from day one. I have to say I'm not very convinced by this, but I'd like your view. It seems to me, probably from what you've said already, that you view Trumpism as a unstable coalition of competing agendas. And if you look at his appointees, it seems that way. You've got anti-deep staters like Tulsi Gabbard, you've got sort of neocon China hawks like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. So what does it look like to you on the personnel side?
I think that's pretty much correct. It's going to be a grab bag of right-leaning people, right-wing people, which is also just a function of the American political system. The presidential two-party structure tends towards that. And I also think that people who claim that about Trump, that he's just going to be suddenly more effective, don't really appreciate how difficult it is to wield the levers of power of the American state. It's actually quite a difficult thing to do. The state itself, this is something that we on the left don't focus on very much, and it's the focus of my scholarly work that, as I said at the beginning, no one cares about, but it's really about the American political development, which is really about the development of the American state. The state in the United States is so complex. It is so gigantic. There is no single power structure. Even as power is on one hand truly centralized in the executive branch, with the entire machinery of state essentially being in the executive branch, there's so many different centers of power within those institutions that it's actually quite difficult to manipulate. You can do things like Trump did with Soleimani. The president can say, go do this, or Obama did with his kill list. Every Tuesday, I think he would review his kill list. So not to say that the president does have doesn't have power. But on the type of structural level, moving the ship of state, it's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do, and you need to be an incredibly talented politician to do that. And Trump just isn't that. The reason that a politician like Hitler was able to actually reform the German state was, one, the state was actually much more simple. In the 1930s, it wasn't as big. It didn't have as many power centers. It didn't do as many things. And two, Hitler had a real talent for actually manipulating the bureaucracy, the actual machinery of state. Even though a lot of recent historiography on Nazi Germany emphasizes the chaos that actually defined its governance, there was an element of actually using the state. Trump has never in his life demonstrated any ability to do anything like this, which is why he's really a tin pot more than anything else. And the phrase tin pot dictator, he's a tin pot president. And the places that are going to be terrible is going to be particularly in ICE. It's going to be on the border. And those were Obama and Biden policies as well. And I think it's in that really liminal border space where you see genuine fascistic like activities take place. But those were done by presidents too. So again, a lot of Sturm und Drang.
I like that. You, Daniel, as someone who likes to and has been active in arguing against making any analogies with Weimar Germany, for example, that's saying that this is not fascism, right? That this is just liberal hysteria. Suggested that that comparison off your own back, even if it was to deny it, so you can't get away from it. But more seriously, to take up your point about the I don't know if inflexibility of the U.S. state or the unwieldiness, the lack of a concentrated sense of power, its dispersed nature. How does that compare then to maybe some other country? Right? And maybe Lee, you have some insight into this yourself, because you say that and you go, okay, fine, I can buy that, but America is the most powerful country by far in the whole world system. So if the U.S. president can't do that, is there an example of a reasonably powerful country somewhere else where the president does have a greater autonomy or ability to kind of transform the state?
No, I mean, like, even look at China. Like, there's a reason that the party itself is concentrated in the urban centers, right? Like that's where the party is most felt, in Beijing and Shanghai, on sort of the eastern coast. I think this is one of the things that Marx like kind of wrote about, but he was never super concerned with the state. But it's there in his criticism of capitalism, which is that these structures, when they last decades, when they last centuries, they accrue. There's so many accretions of these institutions, of these power centers, that they're very difficult to actually control. This is why one of the things that I say only semi-seriously is that we lost in 1914 when the working classes of Europe, thanks guys, when the working classes of Europe fought each other instead of turning against their aristocratic bourgeois overlords. Because not only was that bad in terms of class solidarity, but it was also at a time in the evolution of the state where you could do something like take it over and push it in a new direction. I don't think that's possible now. Basically, I think that the institution has reached such a high level of complexity and at the same time decenteredness that it would be very difficult to move it in a particular direction. And just like we're alienated in every area of our life, we're also alienated from state power in that fundamental Marxian sense, is that we don't have control over it in a real way. And you see this with anxieties about the deep state, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a truth there with the permanent bureaucracy. But I would say it goes beyond that. It just goes into the very nature of state structure in the 21st century.
Right. Okay.
I would tend to agree. I mean, I co-authored a whole book on how China is like that. But just to push back and play devil's advocate a bit, that's a true characterization, I think, of state power in the United States generally, in terms of getting things done. And Trump got very little done in his first term. But there is an area where the president has the most discretionary power surely is in the realm of foreign policy. So obviously Congress ultimately holds the purse strings, so that kind of limits what the executive branch can do.
But not really, not in practice, and hasn't in practice for basically hundreds of years. So to what degree does it formally in the Constitution does, but not for a long time.
Notionally Congress has the one that must authorize war, but has not done so, I think, since.
Well, the US hasn't fought a war since 1942. 42.
Right, so there is a great deal of executive discretion, therefore, in the realm of foreign policy, despite efforts by Congress to rein it in after Vietnam, and an enormous amount of resource concentrated in institutions like the Department for Defense. So the the temptation, it seems to me, of people who are sort of hamstrung domestically and can't get very much done is they move into the realm where they seem to have relative freedom, which is internationally. So Trump has authority over, trade policy, for example. Trump has enormous authority over the military to, as you said, order it into various different actions. I mean, he's not really minded to be that kind of interventionist president, but there is an enormous amount of resource in places like the Pentagon. There is an enormous amount of executive discretion. So in theory, he could do things that would depart from his predecessor in important ways. And it seems to me that although there would be continuity over things like China, where Trump sort of established the new bipartisan consensus over confronting China, the major area of difference could be on Ukraine, could be on countries like Iran. I mean, do you not see any space for innovation given the amount of resource and discretion available to Trump?
So the Ukraine thing, I think, was coming regardless. I think that was always a ridiculous thing for the United States to get super involved in. I think if it wasn't particularly Joe Biden and Antony Blinken in there, they wouldn't have. I don't think an Obama would have gotten involved in Ukraine to the degree that Biden did. I think that's uniquely Biden's, particularly second term Obama. I think that's Biden's socialization as a Cold Warrior, early 1940s born person who genuinely believes in what basically everyone else thinks is bullshit about the United States defending democracy. So I think even a Kamala,
but you think even more so more so than Obama, because
Definitely.
Obama's concerns would have been looking elsewhere, to the Middle East, to the Pacific.
Obama didn't get involved in Syria, really. He did, but not like to the degree that the United States got involved in Ukraine. Second term Obama was very skeptical about those types of interventions. He liked drones. He liked reviewing his kill list, and he liked doing the classic capital P progressive humane war. That was Obama's style. Obama wasn't all about sending weapons into a fight a nuclear power. It's kind of, if you just dead alien look at it, it's kind of insane that the United States has invested so much in Ukraine, which is on Russia's border. Russia is a nuclear power, is much more invested in Ukraine than the United States will ever be. It's a really bizarre policy. Historians are going to look at it as like a gigantic failure. So I would say with Trump, that's almost structural. That the waning of that war, U.S. support in that war, was going to come. I think the U.S. will still be involved in its typical bullshit U.S. way with special ops and trainers and giving some types of weapons, but the crazy number that has occurred under Biden, I think, was always not long for this world. I think, obviously, Israel's annihilation of Gaza is the other big Biden administration foreign policy, and I imagine that Trump will basically just continue. It's basically over, it seems like, to a large degree. The Israel has succeeded in ethnic cleansing Gaza, and it's just going to continue doing that. And I imagine Trump is going to continue giving Israel weapons, particularly at this point. I mean, he's random enough where maybe he sees a particular image of a dead or freezing Palestinian child and is like, you got to stop this now. I mean, that's just Trump's randomness, but that probably won't happen. He'll probably just continue along. He might try to do China stuff, but the fact that tech is much more embedded in the Trump administration this time around mitigates against that, because this is clearly in direct violation of their own capitalist interests. And Trump, as you saw with this H-1B debate, took about 5 seconds to align with capital and say, oh no, Elon Musk is right. Let's bring in these, tech indentured servants type elite workers.
This is just to clarify for people in case they're not familiar and not in the US, a tiff over immigration policy and the type of visas for highly skilled workers, right?
Yeah, basically H-1B visas allow highly skilled workers to come in. Vivek Ramaswamy, that's such an idiot. Vivek Ramaswamy did some obviously ill-advised tweet about how you should praise Screech and you shouldn't Zach and AC Slater from Saved by the Bell because they're bad influences.
These are so many references that are going to need explaining. You're doing like 90s,
you don't have Saved by the Bell abroad. I thought
TV.
Americanization happened.
So anybody under the age of 30 is not going to get these references.
But that's
that's why it was a great tweet. So people, do your own research. Research is power. Research what Saved by the Bell is. But anyway, he gives this ill-advised tweet saying basically you need to valorize the nerd and not valorize the Chad. And obviously the Trump racist, xenophobic base is like, what the fuck are you talking about? Absolutely not. You should valorize the Chad, and we don't want you people here. You people basically being Indians, but all brown people and people of color, essentially. And there was like incredible racism directed against Vivek and Indian workers generally. And when Trump weighed in, he basically, and Elon, I should add, sided with Vivek over their stupid Doge thing. And Trump, when he talked about it, basically just aligned with Vivek and Elon Musk. And so, yeah, obviously capital is what matters to him. I mean, this is what I always found so like distasteful about the sort of former leftists who became like national conservatives, because like it's obviously just such bullshit. Like there's no actual desire to return to manufacturing. That's a chimera. That's never going to happen anyway. And to place all of your faith in Trump like he is some messianic figure who's actually going to push the United States into a different direction is just so flatly stupid that it's kind of amazing that anyone actually believed it. But apparently these guys did, and some podcasters do as well. But yeah, I think the right has no juice. They're not forward-looking either. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if this turns out to be a moment like the late 19th century where you kind of go back and forth between the parties, that no one is able to actually establish a major coalition that is able to last because no one is able to do the fundamental thing, which is redistribute wealth, right? That's what the moment calls for. No one is going to do that. So you're just going to have this sclerotic party system that just sucks, but the United States is still so overwhelmingly powerful that it's still going to be able to do things like have a significant influence on world, international, and economic affairs.
So, well, there's a lot of regional stuff which want to delve more deeply into Ukraine, Europe, NATO, the Middle East, and China, and so on. But just to stick with personnel, because you suggested it in talking about Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, although neither of those is concerned with international affairs, with foreign policy. But
that's what you think.
Well, yeah, that maybe.
Musk is already wading into foreign affairs, right?
I think Musk is not going to last very long. I mean, this is what's also silly. Like when people are like, they're co-presidents, have you paid attention to Trump at all? No. I mean, like, what are you talking about? Musk is not going to be in there in 6 months, and that's a long time.
That's right.
So it's like, you can't even get like worked up about this. What are you getting worked up about? Yeah, like what are you talking about? Much for the last 2 seconds.
So to deal with maybe more serious appointments and more serious kind of proposals, such as they are from the Trump administration, as Lee has already said, you have appointments which point in rather different directions, and it seems like. Well, yeah, I don't know if you take the truism that personnel is politics, and you take that as good coin, then you're going to be looking at something which is pretty eclectic. Notwithstanding your points, Danny, about the essential continuity of the Trump administration's foreign policy with regard to its predecessors, it does seem a little bit wackier and wilder than previous ones. It's
more erratic. I think there's more like there's more chance for like random things to happen than there would be under a Biden. Even though Biden's synapses were dying, so who knows what was actually going on?
A different type of randomness.
Yeah, a different type of randomness. Yeah.
But so what I wanted to ask with that in mind is what Trump's relationship will be with the foreign policy establishment and with the defense establishment, and how deep do you think the anti-deep state strain runs? How much conflict will there be? There was already tensions in his first term, and if Trump, is entering into office for his second term with a clearer idea of the challenges he'll face and the roadblocks put in front of him by the permanent bureaucracy, is there going to be more tension with the deep state than there was previously?
So, I mean, I really do think it's most important to look at this from a structural level. Like in the 1990s, the United States closed bases, right? Like significantly closed a lot of bases and like actually reduced defense contracts when Clinton came in. Eventually got back up by the middle to late 1990s, but that was like a real shift. So I don't think Trump's going to do any of that. So again, there's a lot of like smoke and fire between the deep state and the blob and Trump, but the fundamentals are really going to remain the same. And my guess is just like you saw Tim Cook is giving money to Trump for something. My guess is that at this point the blob has made peace with Trump, and that a lot of people who may have in 2016 been less willing to become like the undersecretaries, the people who actually run the institutions, are going to be more willing. I can't name names, but I already know people in DC who are like kind of more willing to work with Trump than they were 8 years ago. So I think it'll actually be more of a quote unquote steady, i.e. status quo. There will be more status quo hands behind the scenes running things, and I think that will be different. So I think you might actually see less chaos, but it's going to be, again, in the service of this fundamental position, which is that the United States is going to try to remain hegemonic. And speaking of regions, I wrote for Harper's like a long piece on this a few years ago, but it's an absolute fantasy. If any American thinks that the United States is going to be able to remain regionally hegemonic in East Asia for 20 years, I've got a bridge to sell them. That's just literally impossible. The conditions that allowed that to happen after World War II and then after 1989 are just not extant any longer. The GDP of the G7 is just actually going, it's decreasing as a global share faster than people actually imagined. The United States is just far from East Asia. There's a lot fewer Americans than there are Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this moment where there's these fantasies of American imperial domination are in the next 10, 15 years going to come up against material realities, but no one in DC is able to confront them. So I think you're just going to see more of this cancerous rot at the heart of the American system because no one is willing to just open their eyes and accept the obvious. No, China is going to dominate East Asia. The United States is not going to dominate East Asia. So you could either spend 10 years, 15 years planning a sort of defense transition, or you could found AUKUS and just be like, oh, we're just going to remain dominant here ever, which is fucking ridiculous, but never in the DC establishment has never not been fucking ridiculous.
So it's not just the DC establishment. I think that's a very fair characterization of what's going on. But it points to the importance of ideology, not capital I ideology, the big isms. They are all dead. In that sense, we do live in a post-ideological age, but we don't live in an age where people are able to appraise with sober senses the realities of their conditions, right? So they do live in this ideological bubble, and they desperately want the real world to conform to their ideological realities, and then they do real things in the real world to try to make that happen, which is potentially very dangerous and destabilizing. So
yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think it is actually a generational thing. I think if you're under 50, things genuinely do look different. I think that being socialized in a post-Cold War world, or really being socialized during the War on Terror, does shape one's ideas. I mean, you see it in all the bunch of resignations from the State Department over Palestine. So I think there is a generational shift that will occur, and it'll probably be too late. But absolutely, there is a risk of bad things happening. Although I do find.
But can you just spell out what you're saying,
tough.
that generational difference? Because I mean that could point in two directions. But specifically, you're saying that those who grew up in or really came of age and entered kind of the workplace, and particularly in work and foreign policy in an era of unipolarity, that they see the world in a different way to those who were forged by the Cold War. And
I think if you're socialized during the global war on terror, the limits of American power are very clear. And I think that even after Vietnam, nothing approaching that happened because the memory of World War II, and the people who had literally fought in World War II were still around. And I think that sort of base for American imperial hegemony doesn't really exist any longer.
But I mean, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because one could read it the other way around, where to come of age, to be socialized through the Cold War, is to grow up in a world in which there's a limit to American power, a very hard limit, which is where the kind of Soviet influence is. And so you're having to deal with that and to think a little bit more in realist terms, although again, probably very infused by ideological conceptions. And that someone who grows up as a Gen Xer, Reagan coming in and just kind of be like, yeah, we're gonna face down the USSR, tear down the wall, American unipolarity. That would be someone who would have no conception of limits to American power and be completely.
Those people are all over 50. Gen X is like 57. I'm talking about people who were raised in the 1990s with promises of global capitalism winning, and then the realities of their lives in the global war on terror basically.
So maybe the cutoff point is closer to 40 than 50, because I think Alex is right here. It's the kind of generation that came to power kind of at the end of history are the ones that thought that their power was limitless, and they really did drink their own Kool-Aid and believe their own bullshit. So you might
45,
come
you're
to
born in
Biden as
1980. So if
yeah,
you're
more or
50, you're
less.
born in 75. So it's like this in-between generation. I think like they call it Generation Catalano, like not quite Gen X, but also not quite millennial. They're a little, there's not that many of them, but they could go both ways. But millennial and younger, I guess, is what I'm referring to. Millennials are like 45 now.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true to say that people in their sort of 30s or younger are more skeptical towards the claims of liberal ideology in general. But that whole sort of the people who are still in power, still kicking around, this stuff goes really deep. They absolutely believe it to their bones, and they won't be. This is not. I think just to go back to what you said about Ukraine, for example, I don't think this is just a quirk of Biden and his age as a kind of Cold Warrior. I think that sort of hysterical reaction, which I think you're right, will be viewed in retrospect as a kind of insane policy to expand NATO up to Russia's borders and then to avoid any attempt to settle the conflict and just to insist on the right of Ukraine to eventually join NATO and so on. I think in retrospect it will be seen as folly, but it wasn't just Biden pushing this line, right? This was a view shared across the Western establishment and by very significant portions of Western publics as well. So there is something about this grip
Yes.
that of kind of end of history ideology on foreign policy, which has got a hold on people who have still got quite a clinging grip on power. It seems to me.
I think that's absolutely correct, particularly with the people who actually wield power. But I think if you look at the coming generations of people who will staff the foreign policy blob, it's very difficult to be a neocon or a hawk. I
Sure.
think that is viewed as unsophisticated. It is viewed as a historical. So this gets into the problem of the gerontocratic structure of American politics, which I totally agree, and bad shit could happen. But I think you're actually seeing significant change with people under 40, 45, people socialized in the war on terror about what the United States is able to actually accomplish. Also just genuine less interest in it because their lives are worse.
Yeah. I mean, which is why they're skeptical about the claims of liberalism in general, right? Because the material promises of globalization have not paid off for them. I think, which is why you start to see younger people voting for right wing populists and so on. So I know you're involved in the Quincy Institute, so and they're pushing a more kind of realist style foreign policy one, which is consistent with restraint. Has the Quincy Institute done any polling on this to see if there's a kind of empirical confirmation of what you're suggesting, that with the younger generation?
I actually I wrote a big piece on Chomsky that's coming out in the Nation. That will have been out in the Nation by the time this comes out. And yes, there is decline. Let me actually get the numbers. I literally have it right here because I think Chomsky is wrong, and you can read about all the ways I think Chomsky is wrong in this piece. Okay. So I'll just read this to you. A recent poll by the Chicago, these are all very establishment institutions. Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for example, reveals that fewer than 6 in 10 Americans think the United States should play an active role in world affairs. Another poll, this time by Gallup, puts that number at 65%. While these polls still do indicate that most Americans believe the U.S. should remain involved in international politics, things look different when you divide Americans by age. A Pew poll, for instance, discovered that just 33% of adults under the age of 35 and 49% of those between the ages of 35 and 49 consider it, quote, extremely or very important that the U.S. play an active role in world affairs, compared with 66% of those in the 50-64 age group and 74% of those above 65. Trends are very clear. It's not even a question. So the question is just like, what happens? That's so funny. I happen to do like a ton of research on this in the last like 2 months. So yeah, to me, this is definite trend, not even a question.
Yeah, no, those numbers are stark. It's a quarter versus
33% versus 75%. I mean, like it's a total. It's just the waning of World War II, right? Like World War II recedes further into the distance. The United States did fight a just war there, even though if they often did it unjustly, particularly in Japan. But with that memory fading, people do not want the United States gallivanting around the world when they can't afford rent. It's just obvious. So you see it in the numbers empirically.
Well, repeating myself, the 20th century is over, but people are taking long to get on board with that idea. Let's move on to kind of more regional questions. Let's first of all, Ukraine and a potential peace deal there. Lee.
Yeah, this is probably the area where we could expect the biggest disjuncture between Biden and Trump. Is Trump said, we're going to end the war, and some of his allies or supporters have sketched out what a peace deal might look like. Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz. Kellogg is his Ukraine envoy. Fred Fleitz served in his first administration. They've set out what a peace deal would look like. So is that actually what's going to happen? Do you think Trump has a viable plan for settling the conflict?
No, but I do think he'll stop giving weapons relatively quickly. It's of course difficult to know, because if Trump feels like he's able to get some sort of deal from a weapons manufacturer and continue sending weapons, he probably will. But all things being equal, I think he will slowly just cut off weapons, or he might do it fast. Who knows? I don't think there's a plan to settle the conflict. I mean, I think what's going to happen is Russia is going to get parts of eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. It's going to be amalgamated into Russia, and then you'll have land acknowledgments about the unceded territory of Crimea. But I think that that is inevitable, and at this point, you're just sending kids into the grinder. It's really a moral crime, and people who supported that war should really be ashamed, I think.
So, I mean, just to take a step back, essentially what this America First peace deal involves is broadly what you've talked about, which is you basically freeze the conflict. You accept that the Russians have annexed large parts of Ukrainian territory. You don't necessarily acknowledge it fully. You've lost Crimea. You don't particularly want to acknowledge it, but you just accept reality. You freeze the front lines. You put in some kind of buffer zone, maybe policed by UN peacekeepers, something like that. Ukraine doesn't join NATO, something along those lines, and you make sure that Ukraine's got enough weaponry to defend itself. Should Russia decide to restart the war, that's the deterrent thing that's supposed to keep the peace afterwards. But it's not really a peace treaty so much as a ceasefire which just recognizes reality and stops the fighting.
Yeah,
and
like
that
Korea.
seems consistent with what you're saying. Yeah, a bit like Korea. Yeah,
the Korean War hasn't ended. I don't know if you guys know. Technically, it has not ended. The big question to me that's interesting about Ukraine, because I think what you just said, Lee, was going to kind of happen with anyone who wasn't Biden. But the question is, how are the Europeans, the Western Europeans, going to react? That to me is the big question, because Europe is in such decline. And I think that there is going to be a general decline in U.S. support for European military stuff in NATO and elsewhere. And so I genuinely don't know how Western Europe and Central Europe are going to react to this. They're going to want to continue to fund it. They're going to want to continue to be global players, but they're just not in a real way. And obviously, the decline of Europe has been happening for a long time, since 1945, and it continues apace. But I think we're in a real moment of like Europe is really not that important to global politics in a way that's never been true.
I mean, there's, I guess, two ways to read that. I mean, obviously, EU politicians like to talk about a united sovereign Europe, about strategic autonomy. Emmanuel Macron probably foremost amongst them, but it's hardly limited to him. No one really believes these words, obviously. But I think what I want to know, obviously, is in relation to this discussion we're having here, is what the US's relationship will be to Europe. And I think one way to read it is, well, the EU and the UK are just going to swallow whatever the US gives them, and they'll have to follow that lead. The other is that, well, if there's a continuing kind of Trumpian rupture with a post-Cold War order, Europe might actually have to begin to take its word seriously and realize that it might have to bump its defense spending at the very least. How do you see that?
But does Europe even know how to do that? You guys had a good guest on at some point in the last few months, right? Like you can't just build a defense industrial base, right? There's like expertise and knowledge that has been lost over the decades. So I'm not sure if Europe is even really capable of doing it to the degree that it is clearly capable in some regard, obviously. but doing it to the degree where it could like take a stand against Russia, I'm not sure if that's possible. So the question is how do leaders accommodate themselves to that reality as their economic importance, which is obviously one of the most important things, just declines.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of questions which would ensue from that in terms of what would it mean for Europe to take account of its own defense, and there's various ways to interpret that. I mean, you put it, stand up to Russia, but perhaps there's a different interpretation to that where Europe accepts again another one of these pivoting points which doesn't actually come about, which is to accept its diminished role in the world and to come to see itself as not having to really influence international affairs very much and just really kind of taking care and looking after itself. So anyway, there's different kind of strategic and kind of forward-looking ways to plan that out. So that, and I don't want to necessarily get into all of that. More the immediate question is how will Trump's attitude to Europe, to NATO, to Atlanticism as an ideology develop, and how much will it actually put into practice?
Well, it's tough to see because he clearly doesn't love it, but he also did nothing about it in the first term. So what would make the second term different? It's very difficult for me to see anything but institutional inertia continuing until there's some sort of breaking point. That would be my prognosis. Even if Trump rails against it sometimes discursively, I doubt he'll actually do anything to change the structure in a meaningful or useful way.
I think you could argue that Trump actually got what he wanted. Perhaps not under Trump, but certainly under Biden, in terms of NATO countries coughing up more for their own defence. I mean, there is a handful of NATO countries still not spending 2% of GDP on defence. Most of them are projected to do so. That's a significant increase, and what Trump was asking for, and Trump basically got what he wanted.
I mean, that's been a criticism people have been making for decades. I mean, that I know that like once Trump made it, like the liberals hated it, but this is something that across the political spectrum has been argued for a really, really long time.
Since the 1970s, at least.
Since the 1970s, and especially in the 1990s, it really takes off with quote unquote defense conversion. So again, like it's like Trump, it's like only Nixon goes to China. Trump was able to actually get this thing going. And I do think that is a change. But again, the structure is still like kind of there. Like what is NATO? I mean, you guys famously know Dwight Eisenhower said, if we're still there in 1960, we failed. What is the purpose of NATO in the 2020s is just not, it's not really clear in a genuine way.
You remember that famous quote from the first Secretary General of NATO, who I think was
keep the British... Germans down, keep the Soviets out, and keep the Americans in.
Isn't that the purpose still?
Yep, but the Americans are just, this is the big material thing, which is that the Americans just, there's too much social dysfunction here for this to just continue unabated, particularly once younger people start actually getting into office.
Yeah, I think this to extend what we were talking about earlier on in to Europe and to NATO. I mean, I think stuff is so dysfunctional here too. I mean, not perhaps to exactly the same degree in the United States, but again, the grip of this ideology among NATO elites, to an extent that varies, but still is extraordinarily strong. They're still kind of grappling with reality. So what you talked about a minute ago, Alex, the idea that they might come to terms with their role in a diminished sense and having to sort of come to terms with the fact that they can't dictate everything even on their own continent, that still seems quite a long way off. At the same time, the gap between their ideological threat perception, the idea that Russia might, if Ukraine falls or if it's allowed to annex
the Anne Applebaum argument,
it'll menace
they're going
the rest
into
of
Warsaw,
Eastern Europe.
Baby.
And you look at then what they're actually spending on defense. They don't really believe it. They can't really believe it.
Yeah. Well, this is the failure of liberalism, right? Right. This is the whole thing. The reason liberalism is coming apart is it's disconnected from reality, whether you're claiming Donald Trump is Hitler or whether you're claiming that the Russians are going to march into Warsaw, like Timothy Snyder claimed both. Right. Like this is like this is I'm writing about this right now, but this is why liberalism itself is coming apart. And the thing is that, like you guys mentioned this earlier, but the 21st century is not going to be a century of ideology. I think the 20th century was unique in really being a century where people died for ideologies. Could you imagine anyone in the 21st century dying for liberalism, dying for communism, dying for fascism? It's wild. all those Americans on Twitter, you think any one of those guys is going to die for national conservatism?
No, what
Absolutely not.
What happens is at first you decide you're going to die. Secondly, you decide on a symbol that you want to adopt to justify your dying. But to be too grim and not to widen out into too big historical scope, I don't know if we want to add anything on kind of Atlanticism and what that looks like, or if I think we've maybe set our piece on that, and we want to turn to China, which I'm sure, well, both of you will have something to say on, but maybe Lee in particular. The US's confrontational position and stance with regard to China seems baked in. I should give a shout out to a recent episode. Phil Cunliffe interviewed James Lin on Taiwan specifically, so I'd urge listeners
my
to
colleague,
check
my
that
boy,
out.
James Lin.
Yeah, there you go.
You guys definitely heard about him through our podcast, right? Admit it. There's no way you knew James.
Phil got in touch with him. I can't recall exactly through what
we did like
I'm
a
not
5-part series
activity.
on him about the history of Taiwan.
Very good. So there's that available to you two listeners, should you wish to depart from these shores.
Bunga.
But yeah, I mean, in what is Trump's attitude to China going to only differ in degree, and how actually, and this then the question specifically to Lee, how is the CCP going to respond to a different American president? Or, I mean, do you get any sense that their reading is like any different from what it what it has been previously?
Could I actually just ask Lee a question before, because I think it would shape it? Lee, what do you think that Communist Party is? Do you think like they're the vanguard of the revolution, or do you think that they're not? Because I think they are not. I think they're state capitalists, and I think that ship has sailed. But I know there are some people on the left who place hopes in China for some reason. But I'm curious your take on that.
No, I mean, I think the conditions are riper for communist revolution in China than anywhere else. In an objective sort of sense, the very large, discontented urban proletariat and a highly authoritarian, exploitative regime ruling over them. But no, there's certainly nothing communist about the Chinese Communist Party.
That's something
I'm amazed
that's very
that anybody still
fascinating.
thinks that.
It's wild. I think there's no hope. So people like place hope in like China being the vanguard and like the axis of resistance around Iran, but it just shows you how there's really no hope anymore.
So you do get some of this. I mean, I've no, not at all. I think I've seen this myself looking at China. You do get some of the stuff around development assistance, for example, in their development financing in developing countries. Like China's going to be this alternative to IMF austerity. Actually, China has turned into the world's biggest debt collector. It's sweeping cash collateral out. It's insisting on all its loans being repaid in full because they're made on commercial terms by commercial agencies, even though they're state owned. So it goes to your point. I think I'm not a big fan of the term state capitalist. We don't want to get into that because I think there's.
You don't like Friedrich Pollock?
I think you can't have capitalism without the state. The state always plays a role in the maintenance, reproduction of capitalism. That role changes over time. So it's not like we've never had non-state.
There is no free market, baby. The state's always involved. Exactly. Yeah, of course.
And definitely not. No,
I agree with that. Yeah.
So, yeah. But the question was, how is China thinking about Trump? That was the question?
Well, yeah. We can do that first. Yeah. How is China thinking about Trump?
Yeah. So I think it wasn't like a good option versus a bad option, because I think from the Chinese perspective, because Biden had not only continued Trump's China policy, he had intensified it. So the tariffs that Trump put on in his first term were pretty mild compared to the way that Biden took it. He just ratchets it up. He's really ramped up the tech war and turned it into a kind of economic Cold War, and really sort of baked in that bipartisan consensus that China is the enemy, essentially, and the only really long-range credible enemy. That is the only real bipartisan consensus, it seems to me, in the US at the moment. So I think, although relations stabilized from around about 2023, they were really tense. I remember when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, which in retrospect seems like an attempt to sort of saber rattle to get Congress to push through the CHIPS Act. But there was real possibility of Sino-US confrontation, and the US also leaning in very heavily around the Philippines. So it's not like the Chinese would have been thinking, oh, it would be great under Harris. It's going to be bad under both. But the way that the Chinese, I think about Trump is in the way that Danny's talked about it. This is a symptom of American decay and decline. And somehow the Chinese have got to manage that in a way that doesn't precipitate a war the Chinese can't handle. That's the bottom line. So they would expect a kind of erratic approach, but they'll be looking to see if they can do a deal, but probably not really expecting to be able to do anything. Like the hostility now they think is baked in. The Americans are intent on crushing us and putting a boot on our throat permanently. We just have to kind of battle on regardless of what's going on in Washington. I think that's the general outlook.
That it's baked in, I guess, is not subject to question. What I wonder is, and I genuinely don't know, I'm asking a question here to either of you really, to what extent is the kind of confrontational stance with regard to China across the board? Or are there kind of questions of degree and an emphasis which might be worth highlighting looking forward to a Trump second term? Is it going to be primarily economic, going to be primarily trade-based? Is tech's role in the Trump administration going to place more emphasis on intellectual property questions within the economic sphere? Is it going to be primarily geopolitical or strategic? I mean, is there anything that would be worth highlighting?
Well, I will just say it is across the board. I think that both political parties and their elites do believe the United States need to quote unquote confront China. At the same time, there's also this recognition that they need to cooperate with China, particularly over climate change, particularly over the fact that the economies of both countries remain incredibly embedded. But beyond that, I don't think there's much medium term or long term thinking. I think that I think it was Adam Tooze said to me on my podcast, like the only part of the American government that still thinks is the military, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. That people are just inertially expecting that the United States is going to be able to remain dominant, even though every indicator suggests that that's not the case. And Lee, off to you.
No, I think Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor, talked about a small yard and a high fence, and liked to talk about de-risking rather than decoupling. And that was in contrast to, Trump using tariffs and trade in general as a kind of full spectrum economic confrontation with China. And the Biden administration was trying to say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to peel it back to some really important high-tech stuff with military applications. And so semiconductors in particular became the focus of a lot of US sanctions. The difficulty is semiconductors are in everything. So you can't engage in industrial upgrading in a country like China and escape the middle income trap, which is what the CCP is trying to do, without semiconductors. Semiconductors are in all the stuff that China is trying to manufacture. It's central to its made in China 2025 ambitions across the board. It's not only that it's got AI and quantum computing and military applications. It's literally in everything. So this small yard high fence implies a sort of smart approach to foreign policy making that doesn't really exist. So the Chinese absolutely see it as a way, these semiconductor sanctions as a way to just put the boot on China's throat. So I think it is full spectrum confrontation, diplomatic, in the realm of infrastructure. For example, they're trying to compete; it's not really working.
But they can't. There's a limit on this. So what do you say about that? There's a natural limit on this because both of the legitimacy of both of these societies rests on consumption, and they need each other to consume. So this, to me, is the fundamental problem of the 21st century, is that we've created a global system in which political legitimacy, Fritz Bartel's book is good on this, political legitimacy really does rest on consumption, and ultimately you have to provide the pigs with treats. So there's a limit on all of this shit. So this, to me, is like the big question. You could have all of this wrangling and blah, 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 but you're still going to need the cheap goods. You're still going to need the global capital flows to flow around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what seems unique to this as opposed to the original Cold War, which is that the economies weren't embedded in any real way.
There's so many differences, but this is definitely one of the big differences. Is the level of interpenetration of these economies is off the charts. There was some trade and some cross-block investment in the
over
Cold
like
War
wheat in the 70s.
but,
Yeah.
and a bit of oil and so on, but tiny by comparison. China is in many ways much more challenging than the Soviet Union. It's much better at stealing technology. It's much better at about spreading it, adapting it, evolving it than the Soviet Union ever was, for example. But I think I would agree with you on the US side that the legitimacy of the system seems to rest on consumption, though, as you say, that's not really working very well. But on the Chinese side, I think that's less true. So the structural problem of one of the structural problems of the Chinese economy is overemphasis on investment and not enough on consumption. And that is
correct me if I'm wrong. Just a quick question: the elites, though, who live in the cities, really do want to consume. Right? And this is the problem of China. It's that it's so gigantic and there's so many different systems within the country. Like if the elites stopped getting their shit, this would not be good for the Communist Party.
Well, I suppose that's true, and there's a huge amount of capital flight out of China, which shows that the elites are somewhat dissatisfied. But you've still got a savings rate in China of over 50%. So over 50% of household income is still saved in some way and not consumed. And that's a deliberate policy choice by the Chinese Communist Party to extract wealth from households through forced savings and recycle that money through state-controlled banks into state-led projects like industrial upgrading, like defense modernization, etc. So it is a very different model of political economy. Yes, there's some consumption. The promise generally is like economic growth, widening employment, better standard of living, jobs for your kids, that kind of stuff. Now, that's where I think the system's stuttering to some extent. You've got 20% youth unemployment in China. They're not publishing the youth unemployment stats anymore because this promise of basically you sacrifice your liberties and you stay out of politics and we give you a better standard of living over time, which is partly consumption based, but only partly. There's still a huge amount of just wealth extraction from households and recycling that into projects. So it's a bit the system, the legitimation system in China is a bit different to the United States. But certainly I think broadly there is pressure on both sides to kind of keep this within limits and not have a conflict because it would be so disastrous for both sides given the interpenetration of their economies. But as you say, this is why I worry about the ideological side of things, right? Because if you have people in charge who cannot see things clearly and are principally motivated by ideological factors, then you can easily kind of slither over the edge into some kind of accidental conflict.
What would that? So this is the question I have. What would that even look like? A military conflict? I can't. It's like very difficult to even really imagine what would actually happen. Also, you have to remember, like the U.S. doesn't have a mass military anymore. What is this even going to consist of? There's so many problems at home. Like even like in terms of imagination, I can't really imagine what that conflict is going to look like. I can imagine some sort of like undeclared naval battle like occurred in the late 18th century with France, and that occurred, with Germany before World War I and before the US entry into World War I and World War II kind of. But I can't imagine a real war. But maybe that's a failure.
Arguably, most cataclysms in world history have been unimagined, and maybe if you can't imagine them, they don't actually happen.
But people imagined World War I. People were talking about World War I. People were talking about World War II.
Disappointingly, they were up there. It didn't match their expectations in the worst possible way, I think.
But even from like you could imagine that armies in Europe would fight each other. Like what would a military conflict between the U.S. and China look like? Where would it occur? In the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait?
They're the most obvious flashpoints that would lead to the initial conflict. But then how it would develop, I think, is
paratroopers going into Shanghai. It's ridiculous.
Absolutely not. I think there's the idea of a kind of land war in Asia. I think that's off the cards. But you could easily imagine long range strikes on the Chinese mainland by American naval and air assets. And you could imagine
they bomb Japan and South Korea. I mean, like it would be like suicide for our allies in the region to do anything approaching that.
Well, it depends. I think how the conflict emerges would shape very much how other countries in the region would respond. So if it was seen to be just straightforward Chinese aggression, so Xi Jinping wakes up one day and decides to invade Taiwan without any kind of pretext, then I think a lot of people would turn against China. But if it was seen to be some kind of American provocation, or the Taiwanese had provoked them in some way, and you could kind of muddy the waters, then I think it would turn out quite differently. And I think the Chinese would have to fight in an asymmetrical fashion. So presumably a lot of cyber warfare, sabotage, that kind of thing. There would be every trick in the book. I think it would be unlike. I mean, there is always the risk of escalation into nuclear conflict, but assuming that they try to avoid that kind of escalation, then it will be a conflict, I think, that of the type that we had not expected, and we find it difficult to imagine. But I think Alex is right that a lot of major conflicts have been like that. So
when you look at the U.S., though, war was good for the U.S. because it essentially served as an employment program. And it essentially served as an investment program. Tim Barker's dissertation, Cold War Capitalism, is really good about that. Just showing how much the post-war American economy was really, welfare was done through warfare. But ever since the end of the all-volunteer force in the early 1970s, that benefit just doesn't exist. So any type of war that the United States would pursue would basically cause, I think, some sort of collapse at home, not the end of the government, but real depression, real recession at the very least. So it's just very difficult for me to imagine that it ever actually gets there.
Would you say that's the same with Trump's tariffs? I mean, this is what he's proposing is enormous levels of tariffs on Chinese goods, which would, as you say, undercut the consumption and cause massive inflation at home.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, in my opinion. I think that he would have to be a different type of political figure for that to really go through, and that's just not Trump. And he's also older and more strange and less interested than he was the first time around. I would be very surprised if those tariffs go through.
Do you read that then as some kind of negotiating chip that he's trying to get some kind of concessions out of the Chinese?
Yeah, in his addled brain, sure. Yeah, it's like the madman theory. He said stuff like this in the past. He's like, Nixon was great. Just make everyone think you're fucking nuts, and they'll, you go in with the deal, demanding the world, and then you come out. I do think that is correct, and I imagine Xi thinks that as well. My guess is that, like you implied, they're not like that worried about Trump existentially. There's more like, oh, we got to deal with this fucking idiot for another 4 years, flatter him, and things will be fine. I mean, it's just the shame is that structurally the U.S. is still the most powerful country on earth, even if its relative power has declined. So you have this crazy society running things, and there's no future, it seems like, at least in the short term or medium term, where they're going to remove themselves from international politics. And that's really the sort of crisis of the age, but it's kind of a boring crisis a little bit.
So, speculative wargaming and the rest aside, if listeners have been, following us along and are going, how haven't you talked about the Middle East yet? You're the reason that I've written down here, after the words, is the Middle East the key to world peace? I've put joke in parentheses, listener, that's for you. But nevertheless, the
Middle East.
The Middle East.
U.S. wants to be less involved. And that is what's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. The U.S. is going to allow Israel to do what it wants in the pursuit of normalization with the Sunni states. That is what is probably going to happen. Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas have just been revealed as incredibly weak since October 7th. And that is the reality of the situation as I see it. General disengagement, U.S. still the primus inter pares in the region, probably above that even, but is not going to be as involved in the coming decades as it was in the second half of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st. That's my ultimate take on the Middle East. They want normalization, and it looks like they're actually going to get it. In 5 years, Mohammed bin Salman will be just fine normalizing with Israel, is my prediction.
I mean, I completely buy that. To maybe delve into it a little bit more deeply, I think the Iran question is one where, I mean, again, that could be read in two different ways. Iran severely weakened, as you've already said, lost the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah severely weakened, Lebanon, and so on.
Israel
might be a good
intelligence.
moment. Let me just to finish off the question. Is this a good moment for where U.S. strategic planners go, this is the moment now to really take out the mullahs, or is this, do they come to the opposite conclusion and go, actually, Iran is severely weakened, the job's kind of been done?
I don't see how you take out the mullahs. I don't see how that's really possible, and I don't think that this is a moment for another Iraq-style war. You could assassinate them via drone, but it's not going to result in structural transformation. I mean, the thing that the post-October 7th really revealed is the incredible capacity of the Israeli intelligence agencies. Israeli intelligence is wildly competent, and I don't think we knew the degree to which that was true, that they have sources in Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. So you don't need to do it. Really, you don't need to risk an Iraq-style conflict to get what you want in the coming decades. So I just think that I tend to think that the axis of resistance was just a chimera. It was never really real, and that the truth is that Israel and the United States are just really, really powerful and have just much more capacity and capability than any of the other countries in the region. And this has been revealed in the last couple of years.
I agree with you. It's going to be very. I can't foresee any kind of regime change war in Iran, but I could definitely foresee a situation where Trump and Netanyahu team up to put the boot into Iran and kick it while it's down.
They've been doing it for so long, though. I mean, with the various sanctions have crippled Iran for decades at this point. So again, a continuation.
But that's the question. What would be putting the boot in? What would be an escalation without necessarily going to the extremes of a regime change style, Iraq style?
You would have to try to pressure other countries not to deal with them. I mean, that's the only place to really go at this point. The sanctions have already been so devastating. So you'd have to try to pressure Russia, for example, we'll give you the Donbass and Crimea, but you've got to do X or Y vis-a-vis Iran. I think that's where the boot on the neck would have to come from at this point, because the entire U.S.-aligned world has been against Iran for decades, and there's been some freedom of movement for them, particularly since Ukraine with Russia. But I think is
even that possible? I mean, the permeability of sanctions walls has been shown, in pretty stark fashion with regard to Russia. Lee, I know you've written and researched the questions of sanctions and their effectiveness. Maybe Iran's easier to isolate than Russia is. But it's a question of degree. It seems to me that would be implausible.
I think it's probably harder today than it was under Trump, because we have to remember, Trump put really incredibly tight sanctions on Iran, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. This was one of his kind of big set piece foreign policies, I suppose. And I can see something like that being attempted again, but the frictions with China and obviously with Russia are so bad that they're the ones that can help Iran evade sanctions, and the longer that sanctions episode goes on, the easier the target finds it to evade, because they build up the mechanisms for evasion and so on. But you could imagine some combination of intensified economic pressure, of perhaps limited effectiveness, but already poking at something that's very weak and threadbare, coupled with perhaps various military attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, for example. I could imagine something like that easily.
Yeah, more of the same,
All right. To avoid finishing on the glum note of more of the same, it's all so boring. We're trying to make an exciting,
but you see what I'm saying, right? After this
about
conversation,
world politics. Is there to close this off on one question I did want to ask as a way of finishing, because we talked about the way just now about the way that China, for example, would do what it can to help Iran evade sanctions. To what extent, 4 years from now, does the world look more like bipolar, or is it more multipolar? Maybe that's a bit of a really nerdy kind of question to ask, but I mean, it's prompted by the thought that to what extent is there a consolidation amongst Russia, China, etc., into a kind of more of a discrete bloc against the West, or is it much more of a confused picture after the end of Trump's 4 years in which nothing really changes, as you put it?
I don't think Russia or China have global designs in the way the United States did and does. I think that is unique to the United States due to the Protestant millenarianism that is at the core of the country's culture. So I don't think that there was ever a desire to truly globally offset the United States, because that's it's a crazy thing to try to want to dominate the world. Only a Protestant millenarian could possibly want to do that. And they read that onto communism. George Kennan read that onto communism, when I think it was much more embedded in his own particular upbringing. So that's, I think, what I would say there, that the goal is inevitably different. But I think China is going to be hegemonic in its region, and I think Russia is going to be more and more hegemonic in its region. So if that's what you mean by multipolarity, then I would say yes, but I still think the US is going to be the prime global power in 4 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think talking about bipolarity is wrong. I think if you think about what is a pole has a kind of magnetic effect. It draws, pulls iron filings towards it, or it repels it, depending on the charge. Right, that's the notion when we talk about polarity in world affairs. So, which countries exercise a magnetic pull? It's not Russia, because if you look at who votes with Russia over Ukraine, the United Nations, it's between 5 and 7 states. And they're all kind of so-called rogue states, practically. There's hardly any. That's not a poll. And I don't think Russia is particularly hegemonic in it, even in its near abroad. Actually, I think the Ukraine war has exposed it actually as a rather dilapidated great power. Yes, it can mobilize significant resources to fight in what it perceives as its own national interest, its own kind of existential security in its near abroad. But I think across all kinds of metrics, Russian influence, even in Central Asia, in its backyard, has waned.
Yeah. Well, ironically, it's the opposite.
Agreed.
It hasn't been exposed. It's something that we always knew, at least, so anyone who's not a complete idiot already knew. And the invasion of Ukraine has led people to think, or to allow themselves to fantasize that it is this great power in world affairs. I might even exercise a kind of a polar magnetic effect when it is very much the opposite. So,
and I think, it's a similar picture with China. I think I agree with Danny that China does not have global aspirations in the same way as the United States. It does have regional aspirations. It wants its own security. It wants its interest to be respected by regional states, and it's well on the way to achieving that. But if you look at the way that other states respond to it, they're not bandwagoning with it. They're not saying, okay, now we're Chinese allies and everybody else can get lost. So it's not like they're kind of jumping into the Chinese camp. What they're trying to do is remain aligned and connected with as many big powers as possible. What a few of us have been calling polyalignment, right? To remain aligned to many different groups. It's not non-alignment. You're not trying to stay out of it. You want as many connections as possible to maximize your own benefit. So if China's not pulling everybody into its camp, Russia isn't managing to do that. The BRICS don't constitute a pole because there's too much division among them. The only real pole that still exercises this attraction, it is the United States, because the elites in Europe, at least, and a tiny handful of other countries around the world, places like South Korea, Japan, and so on, still desperately want to believe in American hegemony. But it's a small group of countries relative
and
to
even if they don't believe in it.
shrinking.
Yeah, Latin America is on the U.S.'s side, which we didn't get a chance to talk about this. Now you see that with Scheinbaum's recent thing. So recent policies over migration. So the U.S. is still very dominant in the Western Hemisphere, and it has significant allies elsewhere. So less poly-alignment, more polycule alignment.
Very nice.
No one gets laid in the end. That's the punchline.
That's the goal.
I think to go back to what you said right at the start, I think it's right to think this is an era of sort of decay, of rot of American hegemony, rather than the emergence of something new, clear, and stable. Right? Lots of people would love to go back to bipolarity because the Cold War was, stable. There were goodies and baddies and all the rest of it. It's not going in that direction. We're just facing the decay of a system that's been rotting, I think, for some time.
And I guess the ideological reflection of that is derangement, and continuing and accelerating derangement. And that's what we've got to look forward to. But we hope to, at least on this podcast, do some untangling. If you can untangle a derangement, I don't know if we can do that, but we're going to try. All right, Lee, Danny, thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.